So I wanted to talk to you all a little bit about conceptualizing spirituality in Black faith communities and the cultural schemas that exist around prayer, illness, and healing. But first, let me tell you just a little bit about myself. So I was raised in the Midwest by a family that pretty much migrated from the South. And so I was raised in a very firm Southern Christian Baptist faith, very traditional. My grandfather was a deacon in the church. My grandmother was a mother in the church. I was a junior nurse. I was in the junior choir. We went to church every Sunday, most Wednesdays and some Saturdays. And as a matter of fact, in my household, if you didn't go to church on Sunday, there really wasn't much else you could do the rest of the week. It was off limits. Growing up in the church really did instill in me a lot of the lessons that have given me the strength to be the woman that I am today. What I learned very early in that setting was that God heals us. Prayer heals us. And those messages were bountiful throughout the church. I could recite songs that kind of speak to that. If you think about Psalm 147:3, it tells us that God heals the brokenhearted. He binds up our wounds. I can remember my earliest testimony. I was maybe 9 or 10, and I had a situation where I was getting ready to go somewhere. And in the Midwest, we have basements. I know that's not something that you guys have, mostly in Texas. But we were a working class family, so we had an unfinished basement. I was going down the stairs, and I tripped. Right before I hit what would have been the concrete floor, my foot caught on the railing. That was God. I went to church. I went to Sunday school. We prayed about it, and everyone talked about what a good Christian kid I was and how I was saved, and that my prayer is what healed me that day. Sometimes the spoken and unspoken messages in the church is that if you're strong, of good faith, and you lean not unto your own understanding, and definitely not the understanding of others, then God will save you and heal you. However, what I've learned over time is that that message can sometimes incapacitate Black women's ability to seek help when they need it. I remember very vividly a story of a woman that I was working with once, collecting data, who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And she belonged to the Kojic faith, so the Church of God in Christ. She recounted to me the story of how she went to church after her diagnosis had been revealed, and they tried an exorcism on her to remove the bipolar disorder from her, and how damaging that experience was for her. This is not uncommon when you think about the conflict in spirituality between faith communities and mental health recovery. For African American women, and for most Black women, we are held to these cultural stereotypes, these tropes. I'm sure some of you have heard of them. The superwoman, where we can do anything and everything all the time, perfectly, oftentimes at a consequence to ourselves. There's also the trope of the mammy, where we are the nurturer. Come to us with your troubles, talk to us, we will listen to you and take care of you. If you're in our family, if you're in our community, if you're outside of both of those things, our arms are always open and welcome. You probably also have heard about the sapphire. This is this angry Black woman who has this unbridled anger, who's enraged all of the time. These tropes that kind of circle around our own community impact Black women specifically because we spend a good deal of time either trying to counter all of those narratives, we're none of those things. We try very much so to own each of those different pieces of ourselves, or we try to navigate and find a way to vacillate between those different narratives. I am this or I'm not this. And it can be exhausting. It can cause some significant mental health distress. These challenges with our mental health histories for Black women, oftentimes because we serve in those roles with consequence to ourselves, it costs us our own mental health. We don't seek out the services and support that we need to. And our faith then tells us that we shouldn't need to seek out these outside pieces of support because God will heal us. He is there for us. Prayer will save us. As I evolved as a Black woman and as a Christian, I started to notice the conflict between these two areas. My work, when I provided clinical services to individuals, my research working with women with severe mental illnesses, has told me that this is not sustainable. So there has to be some type of other options. What is it that we can do where we can maintain whatever our spiritual grounding is and tells us, but also find ways to seek out support and services where we need it? That tells us, hey, go to the medical community. Seek out some forms of treatment. When God alone isn't saving you and you're still experiencing your mental illnesses, then that's the option, right? But what we know from the research is that cultural mistrust is real. We understand historically that the medical community has used Black bodies without their consent and abused that use to advance medical technology. Those advances sometimes have often reinforced the systematic oppression that has occurred for Black people. So the medical community is not always our first option, a trusted option for us to seek out. There's a conflict there. If our spirituality isn't serving us, and if the medical community, we're just not sure if they will serve us, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we address these issues that we're facing that move a little bit beyond the blues? We know that women experience mental health issues 50% times more than their male counterparts. But we also know for all of those people who express having psychological distress, that Black women tend to seek help 50% less than their white female counterparts. So we are out here with the exact same level of psychological distress, needing the exact same supports and services. If we're like the former person I mentioned that I interviewed, not able to seek it out from our faith community, if you're familiar with what happens in medicine, not able to seek it out from the medical community, and we're at a little bit of a loss on how we travel this path to recovery. Most of us aren't even aware that there is an option for mental health recovery. We resolve that this is our path, this is our state, this is where we need to be, and we toil through it. Oftentimes you'll hear Black women say something, I'm just making it through. And that is our superwoman trope at play. That is our way of saying that we're going to continue on this path that we are, with or without help, because we just don't know where to go and because we know it's what we do. On one hand, that demonstrates excellent resilience. And I think that that is a key characteristic for a lot of Black women. On the other hand, when we do finally seek assistance, we're at a point where our symptomology is more severe and more acute and more chronic and has had more negative impact than what we would have seen had we sought services earlier on. So how do we bend this together? How do we blend all of these different aspects of what we need, these conflicts in our healing, this conflict in our spirituality? What do we do? We have to start to think about how we present narrative. What's the conversation surrounding mental health and recovery in Black communities, specifically for women? How do we balance out? Sometimes I am a little bit of a superwoman. Sometimes I'm a little bit of a sapphire too, and that's okay. But when I know that I need help, there's a resource there for me. We need to find a way to get our faith community to stop pathologizing and demonizing mental illnesses. At the same time, we need to get our treatment communities to stop pathologizing and demonizing our spiritual histories. The conversation has to happen simultaneously. Now, it's not to say that there hasn't been efforts in this. There have been. If you look at the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, they've partnered with Black faith communities and other faith communities to develop what's called NAMI FaithNet. And this is a great resource directed towards spiritual leaders to give them the language to talk about severe and persistent mental illnesses in the church. Black churches are very okay with talking about depression and anxiety because we all get the blues. We all get a little riled up. But when you start talking about bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, they're a little bit silent. Our therapeutic communities are very open to looking at some of this change. NAMI, a national organization for mentally ill, has also partnered with Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated to start to bring the conversation into the Black female communities so that we can have these larger conversations. But what happens when we go to therapy and when we say we were talking to our grandmother about what we've been experiencing, or we were talking to God out loud and having a conversation? That sometimes is pathologized. And so there has to be a way to have both of these communities, both of these sides, figure out how to have different conversations. I recently attended a training for work that talked about crucial conversations. There's a book out about that now. Some of you have probably heard about it. It's fairly popular. It's a new way to kind of have difficult dialogues. And I think when we talk about faith and mental health recovery for Black women, that's a difficult dialogue. That training was a day-long training. I can't remember a lot of what happened because it was exhausting. But one thing stuck with me from that day, and that was the use of the word "and." When you have a conversation, when you're in a disagreement, don't say yes, but, say yes, and. And that somehow really resonated with me, thinking about how do we blend together faith, my spirituality, and my need for mental health resources. Even when I think about my own path and my own mental health history and seeking out services, I remember how shy I was about talking to my family about it. I remember the discussion when my mother found out I was in counseling and what she thought about that. But I think what was missing for me, even to articulate it to her, was the "and." Me seeking out treatment doesn't mean that I wasn't also praying. I definitely was. If we can focus the conversation on "and," you can pray, you can have your spiritual depth, you can walk your spiritual walk, and you can seek out treatment. And you can take medication, because that's a big step for a lot of people in the Black faith community. You can do both of those things simultaneously and remain allegiance to who you are as a person, who you are as a spiritual being, while you are allowing God to provide the resources that are available to you to heal you. So for all of you here, for the people who are practitioners, when you're talking to Black women about mental health and recovery, talk about the "and." Figure out how to infuse their spirituality into the work that you're doing. If you're a faith leader and you're talking with someone who's struggling with a mental health challenge or a significant and persistent mental illness, provide the options for them to seek treatment while you pray with them. If you're just a friend or a spouse or a peer of someone who is struggling with the balance of what do I do with my faith when I sit down or I take my Xanax, or I talk to a doctor, or I tell someone secrets of my family, tell them they can do both. You can be spiritual. You can walk that walk. You can take your medication. You can treat your illness, and you can recover. Thank you.